Hello, Joe's Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. It is episode 28 of the Grindset stream, episode 28 of Escaping the Moldbug Matrix. Today we will finally end the first year, 2007, of UR. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram, and support me on Locals, subscribe, star, and buy me a coffee, as well as check out the Substack. All right. Almost done, guys. Benazir Bhutto mob hit in Pakistan. Mentions Moldbug, December 27th, 2007. All right. I usually avoid mentioning current events. It attracts too many readers. However, Benazir Bhutto has just been whacked in Pakistan. And since I have discussed Pakistan in the past, I thought I'd say a few words. Melvin to Washington, this is what happens when you let the Times run your foreign policy. According to some early reports, which may of course be wrong, Mrs. Bhutto was actually assassinated twice. First, she was shot in the head by a sniper, and then a little later, her whole entourage was blown up by a suicide bomber. You can't say these people aren't thorough. Of course, using multiple assassins isn't exactly a new idea, but it's always impressive when more than one gets through. You might say it sends something of a message. Who whacked Benazir Bhutto and why? Obviously, I have no idea at all. All rumors that I or the select group of internal arms executives, oil sheikhs, and gold speculators I advise are involved in any clandestine activities are unsubstantiated. Let me start, however, by explaining the power dynamics of Pakistan. You probably already know this, and if you don't, I discussed it earlier, but it is certainly worth refreshing. Political power in Pakistan is shared among a huge variety of parties, gangs, cliques, alliances, mafias, liberation fronts, Islamic sects, human rights groups, military units, and the like. All of them have one goal: to maximize their capture of the economic production of the Indus River Basin. You may think of this area as a crap hole, and it would be going too far to say that you're utterly wrong, but it is also traditionally a prosperous and influential region. It continues to be inhabited by productive and civilized individuals, and anyone who owns or commands any share in its government or revenue can become almost arbitrarily wealthy. At the risk of oversimplifying, the Pakistani movements are presently aligned in three major factions. None of these factions have yet been able to defeat either of the others. However, each has its own vision of Pakistan, in which it prevails totally and any of them could win. The first and simplest faction is the Pakistani military. I call it PACMIL. Pakistani military's assets are relatively cohesive command structure, military superiority in all conventional conflicts, and a fat-walleted, well-muscled Western patron in the US DoD. In PACMIL's vision of the future, Pakistan looks a lot like Singapore or Dubai. It is a peaceful, wealthy country with strong internal order and has as little politics as possible. PACMIL retains many organizational traditions from the British Empire, which had it survived, would surely have maintained the Indus River Basin in just this manner. Unfortunately, PACMIL is the weakest faction in Pakistan. At least I think it's the least likely to win. PACMIL's problem is that its American patron is on the Republican side of the fence, i.e. it is a client of the Red Empire. And historically, this is not a stable position. Ask No Dien Diem, Ferdinand Marcos, or Fulgencio Batista how well that one worked out. To be identified as a client of the Red Empire, a horrible dictatorship, and survive, your regime pretty much needs to be sitting on trillions of barrels of oil, which PACMIL ain't. See my advice for PACMIL, which I think is still very much valid. PACMIL is, of course, losing strength because of the decline of the Bush administration, which is now completely moribund and non-operational. George W. Bush has about as much influence in Washington these days as the Pope. It's not a little messy, certainly less than Bono. So the one thing I want to say here is, where did you say this? You run like... Yeah, that the military dictatorship running Pakistan would leave it stable and wealthy. We know that's BS because we already had a military dictatorship in Pakistan in the 70s. That led to a war with India where they got crushed. So it's like Moldbug just lives in this alternate dimension. I don't know what else to say. Like, all the three wars with India were all led by the Pakistani military, all of which were disastrous. Almost like that's why it's not in charge, Logos.
Yeah, I don't know much about any of this stuff. This is all you.
The second faction in Pakistan, intermediate in power, i.e., probability of victory, is the Westernist faction, journalists, human rights groups, lawyers, professors, and other well-heeled, well-educated mouth flappers. Let's call the Western policy NGO stand. In the vision of NGO stand, Pakistan turns into New Jersey. That is, it becomes a normal third world country with a lot of corruption, but a government that is basically stable and secure and has no significant enemies, foreign or domestic, such as, for example, India or Sri Lanka. While this state of affairs is by no means as profitable as the Dubai state of affairs, it still provides plenty of cash for all kinds of people. It also generates more government jobs, which is not an insignificant factor in that part of the world, or any part of the world. NGO stand is or was, of course, Bhutto's faction. Its chief claim to fame is that it's sponsored by the Western establishment, i.e. the State Department, the Times, etc., etc. It is clean and sweet and true, at least relatively clean and sweet and true. Obviously, it is not a secret that Bhutto herself is a mob queen, at least that many of her associates were gangsters, but the Westerners had an easy solution for this. If they needed to come across as especially clean and sweet and true, they could just condemn Bhutto as a mob queen. She was not offended, at least not unusually offended. You think she didn't know she was a gangster? So, for example, this article by Jemima Khan did not terminate the membership of Imran Khan as a leading capo and NGO stand. If Musharraf goes down, there'll be plenty for everyone to eat. The main disadvantage of the Westernists, as we've just seen, is that they have no significant military or paramilitary arm. They have a loose connection to a wide variety of small-time gangsters, and they have a powerful base in the feudal Pakistani political parties. I'm sure Bhutto knew people who could get somebody whacked, but a really sustained campaign of terror and murder was just beyond her. Since no one will ever be able to capture and hold Pakistan without some real muscle, the NGO standees have only two options. One is to capture the military, and the other is to depend on the Islamists. Since they weren't born yesterday, they work both angles. Obviously, this is a very dangerous strategy, and obviously it has not worked out for the best. Capturing and commanding Pakmil is the only viable exit strategy for NGO stand. It is never a good idea to assume that powerful people are stupid, and I'm sure the human rights groups recognize that if it's them against the mullahs will kick their asses. We are talking about a country which is next door to Iran, after all. However, NGO stand needs the Islamists because it cannot succeed without causing trouble, and the only people who can cause trouble in Pakistan are the Islamists. If there is no trouble in Pakistan, Pakistan gets no press in the West. People forget about it. And if Pakistan gets no press in the West, all of its human rights groups and journalists and lawyers and other people who are good and clean and true might as well be on the dark side of Uranus for all the good their fancy Harvard and Oxford connections will do. Obviously, the Islamists are our third faction. Call them Talibanistan. This is very little to say about the Talibanistanis, but my guess is that they'll win in the end. Probably after an intermediate victory by the Westernists, exactly as in Iran. Well, I'll just say in light of November of 2021 in Afghanistan proper, Moldbug might be right on this.
Yep.
The Islamists are the natural winners because, as today's events prove, they are the baddest mofos between the Hindu Kush and the Himalayas and the Indian Ocean. These neighbors make the Russian mob look like the Catholic Church. They are to the Crips as the Crips are to the Salvation Army, to MS-13 as MS-13 is to the Mushlaws. We're talking about some stone-cold thug killers, and the smart money has to be on them. The Islamists were suspicious of Bhutto because of their possibility that she might ally with Musharraf, and NGO stand and Pakmil would get together and hunt them both down. Clearly, this is Washington's official bipartisan centrist plan. It has little chance of working because NGO stand has no incentive to eradicate Taliban stand unless it obtains full and permanent control over Pakmil, and Pakmil can frustrate this objective simply by refusing to fight Taliban whenever civilian politicians seem to be gaining control over the Pakistani military. But this alliance between the state, defense, Bhutto, and Musharraf, while about as durable as a pile of eggs, was obviously serious enough to worry some people. And as we've seen, these people are not exactly given to restraint. So Bhutto was walking a very delicate tightrope. She had to ride to power on the wave of Islamic terror. This is a very funky wave full of logs, dead hogs, and used tires, and you certainly don't want to wipe out on it. It's essential to remember that within the Pakistani opposition to Musharraf, there is no precise division between Westernists and Islamists. For example, Nawaz Sharif has ties to Westernist forces and ties to Islamist forces. There are people who have positioned themselves between Sharif and Bhutto, people who are between Sharif and Mullah Omar, etc., etc. There is also a continuum between Musharraf and the Islamists, Musharraf and Bhutto, etc., etc. All of these allegiances can shift with the tides of fate. When affairs of state are decided by factions organized on the basis of opinion, opinions become remarkably flexible. That is not to say that there are no genuine convictions at all in Pakistan, but it's more or less impossible for an outside observer to distinguish them with any degree of confidence. What is very clear is that no two or three groups can truly share power, and once one of them collapses, either another will follow or the conflict between the remaining two will become more violent. My guess is that Benazir Bhutto's death will make some people in the Islamic movement happy and some people unhappy. I suspect that the same can be said for the Pakistani military. Since these feelings are relatively private, you will probably not be able to read about them in the New York Times, or you are for that matter. All will feign sadness, but some will be laughing deep down inside. If you are under some illusion that modern politics, let alone modern Pakistani politics, is anything like a fit occupation for honorable gentlemen or ladies, I fear you're setting yourself up for nothing but disappointment. When the whole idea of Bhutto returning to Pakistan started to crop up, I exchanged some emails on the subject with a friend of mine who is from Pakistan via Dubai. Well, my correspondent is 100% westernized, his parents are not. And right up until Bhutto actually got off the plane by his report, they were confident that no such thing could happen, because the people at the State Department cannot possibly be so stupid. One interesting way to review these events is to read a series of articles on Pakistan that have appeared in the Times since my first post on the crisis. I'm not going to get into as much details this time. I think the general concept ought to be clear. First, November 6th, we have this op-ed, or supposedly by Bhutto herself, Musharraf's Marshall Plan. In this piece, Pinky, or at least Pinky's people, make the standard demands, surrender or be crushed, etc., etc. And they roll out the standard argument, which is that suspending habeas corpus is not only an inefficient way to fight a civil war, but actually counterproductive. The United States can promote democracy, which is the only way to truly contain extremism and terrorism, by telling General Musharraf that it does not accept martial law and that it expects him to conduct free, fair, impartial, and internationally monitored elections within 60 days under a reconstituted election commission. Tell it to Seward's little bell, kids. But no, Pinky's love for Pakistan is so great that she has no concern for her personal safety. Very conventionally, the assassination attempt against me last month that resulted in the deaths of at least 140 people is being used as the rationale to stop the democratic process, by which my party would most likely have swept parliamentary elections. You think, in the best case scenario, I imagine Benazir Bhutto as a sort of Pakistani Carmela Soprano, kind of a semi-consciously turning a blind eye to her husband's profession. In that case, I suppose I should feel a little sympathy, and my real anger should be at the power brokers behind her pointless and outstandingly dangerous career as a political mafia queen. Okay, so we move on to November 17th, and this equates Meretricious piece by David Rode. Envoy elicits no new promises. Note that this is not an op-ed or even news analysis. This here is hard news. I'm particularly fond of that detail that Ambassador Negroponte met with General Kalani once. Alone, it's sort of as if little Carmine had dispatched Johnny Sack to meet privately with Polly Walnuts, after which Tony would have the privilege of meeting with both of them. I'm also enchanted with this sentence. The move which General Musharraf has said is an effort to curb terrorism is widely seen by Pakistanis as an effort by the increasingly unpopular ruler to cling to power. I am quite confident that whoever is the next leader of Pakistan, he or she will not be clinging to power like a rat or on a floating board. Or rather, I would like to think that the Pakistan will experience periods of actual political stability. Somehow, I'm not sure Mr. Rhodes' efforts, I momentarily mistyped his name and started to wonder if he was also responsible for the Jameson raid, have made that more likely. I also wonder if there's such a thing as a mob lawyer. If there is such a thing as a mob journalist, the mind boggles. Despite the promising headline above, in the month after Ambassador Sacramoni's visit, Musharraf and or his people caved. He promised to step down as army chief and did. He promised elections and banned Sharif while allowing Bhutto to run. He ended the state of emergency. The only steps he refused to take were those that obviously would have signaled the end of his regime, end of PACMIL as an independent political power, such as restoring the suspended judges. We quickly saw the truth of the matter on the alliance between Pinky and Islamists. On December the 12th, Carlotta Gall, who was well named indeed, recounted a truly tear-jerking picture of secret detentions emerge in Pakistan. No more Fort McHenry for the little stewards of the Hindu Kush. I'm afraid that these days, if Pakistan wants to detain people like the murderers of Daniel Pearl, whom Carlotta Gall may well have known in person, it wouldn't just be able to starve them to death and toss them on a garbage heap. It will have to give them a 5-star gold-plated trial with enough lawyers to invade Nepal. I'm sure Angelina Jolie will be happy to pay for all this. So why not just let your prisoners go instead? If you have to play by the rules, why play at all? Just sit tight, things will go to hell, and the rules will change back again. They have to. If they don't, it's definitely time to buy those Emirate tickets. Oh, I'm sure of a few of these detainees are innocent, but frankly, the Romans had it right when they said that the law is silent at time of war. If your country is invaded by an enemy army, you can't arrest every soldier wearing the wrong uniform and charge them with trespassing. And the same applies even if the enemy adopts an urban guerrilla strategy. What's going on in Pakistan is war. The concept of guilt and innocence is not even meaningful in war. Your enemies are not criminals, they are enemies. The criminalization of war, the move to redefine every war as a police action, creates nasty, interminable, and recurring conflicts that cannot be won. As Edward Lutwak points out, all guerrilla wars, urban or rural, urban guerrilla is a common euphemism meaning terrorist, can be won by detaining every human being who might possibly be an enemy, holding them secretly until the war is over and the winner is clear, and then releasing them without punishment. Like, duh, man. What has more negative impact on innocent civilians, internment in a civilized detention center or involvement in a civil war? Well, I mean, here's the obvious problem here, Logos, right? I mean, what do you think the international community would say to that? What pressure do you think they put on a country that did that?
I don't know.
Well, a lot. The United States tried to do that in Vietnam with strategic hamlets, and I mean, we kind of miffed, but there was a lot of blowback, especially from the press. And even look at how something like Guantanamo Bay was covered by the press at this time.
That's true, but the press is kind of like selective in what they cover. Like Guantanamo Bay was covered by the press, but we had like torture camps in Afghanistan that got like leaked by whistleblowers, and the press didn't cover them nearly to the extent.
That's true, but I mean, Pakistan is not really on the press's good side.
That's also true.
So if Pakistan were to do something this heavy-handed, I don't think they'd be too kind to that. You know, as Trinquirer wrote in Modern War, the service that the Westerners are performing on behalf of the Islamists is an absolute military necessity. Modern warfare is a new experience for the majority of our fellow citizens, even among our friends. The systematic conduct of raids will run into opposition, resulting generally from a total lack of understanding of the enemy and his methods of warfare. This will often be very difficult to overcome. For example, the fact that the enemy's warfare organization in a single city may consist of several thousand men will come as a surprise even to the majority of high administrative functionaries who thought sincerely they were dealing with only a few isolated criminals. One of the first problems encountered that of lodging the individuals arrested will generally not have been anticipated. Prisons designed especially to accommodate offenders against common law will rapidly become inadequate and will not meet our needs. We will be compelled to intern the prisoners under improvised, often deplorable conditions, which will be led to justifiable criticism of our adversaries will exploit. From the beginning of hostilities, prison camps should be set up according to the conditions laid down by the Geneva Convention. They should be sufficiently large to take care of all prisoners until the end of the war. By every means, and this is quite a legitimate tactic, our opponents will seek to slow down and, if possible, put an end to our operations. But the fact that a state of war will generally not have been declared will be, as we have already indicated, one of the most effective means of achieving this. In particular, they will attempt to have arrested terrorists treated as ordinary criminals and to have members of their organizations considered as minor peacetime offenders. On this subject, the files of the Algiers terrorist organization divulge some particularly interesting documents. We are no longer protected by legality, wrote the chief of the Algiers FLN in 1957, when the army had taken over the functions of the police. We ask all our friends to do the impossible to have legality reestablished, otherwise we are lost. Actually, the peacetime laws gave our enemies maximum opportunities for evading pursuit. It was vital to them that legality be strictly applied. The appeal was not launched in vain. Shortly thereafter, a violent press campaign was unleashed, both in France and abroad, demanding that peacetime laws be strictly adhered to in the course of police operations. That's the life in the big city, kids. If your spectacles were more rosy, I'm sorry to have to break it. Please do not blame the bearer of bad news. Next, we have the anonymous stentorian voice of the Times editors themselves. Could even Pinch have taken an interest on December the 22nd in an aptly titled editorial weakening Pakistan. This is the pure voice of power when it has its dudgeon up. The Times does not ask, it tells. When it is displeased, it says so frankly. One does not make little jokes with the Times. But perhaps... Well, hold on. That's all Moldbug does is make little jokes with the Times.
Mm-hmm.
So, what is this, Schrodinger's Moldbug now? But perhaps someone there does have a sense of humor. On Christmas Eve, a whole gaggle of Timesmen and Timeswomen, perhaps already salivating about Pulitzers to come, suggests that perhaps Mushy's revenue stream from the U.S. taxpayer should be cut off, and U.S. officials see waste in billions sent to Pakistan. I think this makes the relationship pretty clear, wouldn't you say? And finally, we have the Times obituary for Pinky, obviously written well in advance and not bad at all. Benazir Bhutto, 54, lived in the eye of a Pakistan storm. I love the bit about Zardari being the Nelson Mandela of Pakistan, perhaps more the Jacob Zuma of Pakistan. But might the label be more apt than it seems? Surely a topic for another day. No, I do not really advise a select group of international arms executives, oil sheikhs, and gold speculators, although perhaps it's not too late to start. If you're reading You Are and you happen to be an international arms executive, oil sheikh, or gold speculator. I mean, is there anything you want to add to that, Logos? I mean, it's just, not bad, basically, a long one.
No, I don't know crap about Pakistan and international politics, so there's just nothing to...
Well, okay, but anything about, like, the solutions Moldbug is proposing, or have we already beaten that to death?
I think you've beaten that to death, and I don't think I have anything constructive to add on it.
I guess the other thing I want to say, too, is about the last article, is this French counterinsurgency guy that he loves to talk about. France lost the war in Algeria, and it's because he got replaced. It's like, bro. But that's what I say would happen, Logos, right? You play these hardball tactics, and then the press gets amped up, and the guy doing it gets replaced.
Mm-hmm.
So that's literally what happened with the guy that he's always quoting.
Yep.
So I don't know. Like, what do you want to say, right? All right, now this is our last one for the year. It's a silly poem, so I'm going to go ahead and read it. Poem for the new year, Mentions Moldbug, December 31st, 2007. De rerum natura, this is why a cypress grown in a windy rock will find its trunk curved to the shape of a long-shanked fishhook. A straight line shot sideways from the ground to swing hard sunward. Just before it peaks, the young bark lime, green with fertilizer, cries fiat lux in lines between 2 points, and learns quick in a foot you'll see him turn his further son to that simple child's course. Hoisted human for a sail, pissing off the wind that hits head on and pivots mass from roots to divide his airflow by a sign of theta. For that old thing which to name is to invite, as you notice with a change to get acquainted, comes with teeth and claws more brown than red. Whatever she eats, it changes colors as it dries. I'll just say computer programmers should not dabble in poetry. I'll just say that. Okay, so we're done with 2007 Logos. Should we keep going today? Because that was awfully short.
Well, of course. I think we'll do a stream later that just like does 2007 review or something, but for now we can just keep going.
Okay. That makes sense. Oh boy. Okay. Oh, you ready for this, Logos? Here we go.
Okay, now you've got my attention.
A straightforward explanation of the present financial crisis, Part 1. January 3rd, 2008. There we go. Perhaps you've noticed that some funky stuff is going down in the financial markets. Most normal people seem to understand finance the way I understand physics, or poetry for that matter. I understand that if you're holding a brick of lead and you drop it, it will hit your foot. I seem to recall that the brick will accelerate at 9.8 meters per second squared. Apparently that has something to do with general relativity. Perhaps if I boned up on it for a year or two and gain some vague understanding of GR. But I'm happy to leave it to the physicists. If you think of finance this way, I'm afraid you've been misinformed. First, finance is not a science. Secondly, finance is not intrinsically complicated. And third, unless you're a physicist, your life will be pretty much the same whether you understand relativity or not. You may not be interested in war, Trotsky once said, but war is interested in you. The same is surely true of finance. All right, we'll stop here, Logos. Has finance been adequately defined?
No. A lot of people confuse like econ, finance, and so on. I mean, he hasn't really defined it. We'll see if he does it going forward.
Well, he says it's not a science. Would you agree with that?
Oh, that's definitely true.
Okay.
100%.
Okay. A better way to think of our present financial system is to compare it to Microsoft Windows. Windows is indeed complicated. It is astoundingly brilliant, profoundly complicated. If there's anyone even in the world, even at Microsoft, who understands all of Windows, he or she must have the brain the size of a basketball. One would think this individual would have at least been photographed at some point. It took them 6 years to ship Windows Vista, and I really have no idea how the heck they did it. But Windows is not intrinsically complicated. It is a time-sharing kernel with a graphic user interface. A smart undergraduate can write a time-sharing kernel with basically the same functionality as Windows as homework in a semester. The same can be said of the GUI, which is perhaps a bit more code, but is certainly less complex. I wouldn't have the same student write both. I do feel this would be a little much. Windows is complicated because it is both ancient and mature. It has been around for a long time, 20 years, and it's been used to solve just about any problem on OS could conceivably solve, including quite a few that it has no business at all in solving. Exactly the same can be said of the modern financial system. The difference is that Western finance is 10 times as old as Windows, if not 20 or 30. The result is that, as with Windows, people can spend their entire lives trying to understand a single small corner of it, say real estate or commodities or bonds or whatever. To actually understand all of modern finance, you would need the brain the size of a beach ball. That would certainly attract notice, and you might have some trouble getting, whatever. Learning Windows or Linux or OS X or whatever, they are all humongous, is an awful way to understand operating systems. You can put as much work into them as you want, and you will learn, and all you will learn is a tiny scrap of the basketball. So even the people at Microsoft who work on Windows all day do not have degrees in Windowsology. They learn OS the same way I did, by studying the principles, which are not at all complex, and then writing a toy OS. Unfortunately, if there's any equivalent of the toy OS approach in finance or economics, I have not run into it. But this is UR, and we never let a small problem like that stop us. Certainly the closest, here we go, logo. Certainly the closest in toy economics is the Austrian school. But when you read the Austrians, you are getting a good dose of Windowsology. Even a very thorough Austrian treatment like Rothbard's exists to describe the financial system as it is, not as an undergrad would build it. Worse, the founding treatise of modern Misesian Austrian school dates to 1912, and the Austrians have spent most of the century since just fending off their many enemies. So you were actually getting a sort of Habsburg Windowsology. It is an entertaining task to try to map Mises' terms to the contents of today's Wall Street Journal, but I can't say it's especially easy or productive. So there you go, Logos. I mean, what do you got to say?
I think everybody knows what I'm going to say at this point. It's just silly. To make Austrian economics the toy model of the economy is just crazy. I have never talked to an Austrian such that I can't ask them the most basic economic questions, and their retort will be something like, "That's psychology, not economics." If you have to punt to answer the basic questions of decision making that econ has to answer, we're done. Your model's useless to me.
Okay. So I thought I'd give the toy OS model, which thanks to Conrad Roth, I call Nitro Economics, a spin in explaining what's up with all the SIVs, CDOs, and of course these famous subprime loans. Ideally, the less you know about finance, economics, or accounting, the better. If you do have some understanding of this area, please try to suppress it. Of course, our toy financial system will exist only in our shared imaginations. However, we do need to imagine building it because we are assigning the task of our imaginary undergraduate. One easy way to do so is to set our actors not in the real world, but in the virtual world. Well, isn't that convenient, Logos? We'll just have an economy that's totally fictitious.
I mean, you have to do it to a degree to build some more and more details on the economy. I mean, that's something we have to do in school just so we can learn like one part of a model, then we build on it. So that's not terrible on its face.
Okay. Uh, where were we? This is kind of cool because, as everyone who hasn't been living in the cave for the last 10 years know, virtual worlds really do have economics. Here is one blog, unfortunately, quite Windowsological, devoted to virtual economics. Unfortunately, the virtual worlds that exist today tend to have very primitive financial systems. Think Windows 1.0. They are more focused on killing orcs or chatting with giant inflatable, or whatever than options and equities and mortgage-backed securities. And what they do have tends to be copied from the big room, which gives us more Windowsology. Nitro economics, if you want to sound more scientific, you can call it synthetic economics, is different. It is set in the virtual world of Nitropia, which doesn't exist but easily could. Orcs and other things are no strangers to Nitropia. There's no economics without fun. But the main point of the place is that it has a financial system which is simple and makes sense. We can use Nitro economics to understand real situations in the real world, such as the subprime crisis, with a simple 3-step process. First, we set up a scenario in Nitropia, which we claim is analogous to the real-world scenario we're trying to understand. Second, we figure out what would happen in Nitropia. Third, we connect this back to the real-world result. While the process is certainly non-trivial and offers great latitude for error, it is also a lot easier than Windowsology, especially if you know nothing about Windows. The first cool thing about Nitropia is that it has no financial system at all. Unlike other inferior virtual economies, it does not distinguish between money and other virtual objects. A monetary token in Nitropia is an object like any other, a magic sword or whatever. A player in Nitropia has a lot of money, just owns a lot of these tokens. There's no special separate bank balance. Today, I'm going to carefully skip over the issues of what money is and why some goods are money and others are not. This is a fascinating question, and we shall return to it. However, the answer does not help us understanding the subprime crisis. Okay, what do you think about this statement here, Logos?
I think that's fair enough.
Okay. Rather, I will just declare my personal ukase that the monetary token in Nitropia is the calorie. Calories have the following properties. Every calorie is identical to every other calorie. Okay, fungibility. Any number of calories can be trivially stored or carried. To remain alive, an Nitropian must eat 1 calorie a day. Calories are not directly useful for any other purpose. Nitropia contains a fixed number of calories, 2 to the 32nd power. Eaten calories reappear at a random point in Nitropia. In other words, the calorie system is a closed-loop financial system. You probably understand intuitively why this is ideal, but we'll certainly return to the subject. Nitropia is divided into 2 parts. Nitro City, where Nitropians hang out and chat with their friends in the dungeons of Yendor, and which is infested with orcs and other monsters, but also contains magic swords and other useful trinkets. At the beginning of time, all calories are in Yendor, so Nitropians need to kill if they want to eat. A small monster-proof door in Nitro City leads down into Yendor. The second cool feature of Nitropia is a frictionless market. The market only works in Nitro City. There's no coverage in Yendor, so to speak. In Nitro City, any Nitropian can teleport any object, calories, magical swords, and instantly to any other Nitropian. There are no delivery or transaction costs. Moreover, Nitropians can solve their ancient who gives first problem by conducting specified exchanges in which all goods are as described or no trade takes place. And Nitropians of especially geeky bent can upload trading bots which make automatic trades, allowing them to design any market mechanism whatsoever. So we'll assume that for every object O, there are a marked bid and ask price in calories. The ask price is the minimum number of calories that anyone who has an O will accept in exchange. The bid price is the maximum number of calories that anyone who wants an O will pay. For common objects, ask and bid will probably be closed. Of course, prices change all the time with rich, complex, and constantly changing lives of Nitropians. The third cool feature of Nitropia is a system of formal promises in which Nitropians can promise to perform some action in future. Promises in Nitropia are transferable objects just like calories or magic swords. The beneficiary of the promise is the holder of the object. Thus, for any promise, there is a promise writer and a promise holder. A common standard promise is a promise to deliver some quantity of calories Q at some maturity time M. We call one of these promises a ticket. The difference between the present time N and the maturity time M is the term of the ticket. Promises in Nitropia are automatically enforced. If a Nitropian writes some promise and fails to deliver, she is said to choke. When a Nitropian chokes, her account is liquidated. All goods in it are sold on the open market. All promises written by the liquidated Neutropian are canceled, prorated by the current ask price of the promised good, and refunded to the promise holder of the proceeds of the liquidation sale. Neutropians who write promises can also accept restrictions. A restriction also automatically enforced as a promise with no beneficiary. For example, a promise writer may promise to stay out of Yendor for obvious reasons. Restrictions may also include disclosure of any and all information about the promise writer, including objects possessed and other promises written. In general, restrictions are useful because a promise from a Neutropian who accepts certain kinds of restrictions may well sell for more calories. More on this subject later. Okay, we now know enough about Neutropia to understand the subprime mortgage crisis, or at least its simplified Neutropian equivalent. Well, okay, bookmark. What do you think about what you just said here?
I think it's been way too long focusing on little things that didn't matter, but now it's getting to the point where he's talking about loans, promises to pay loans, and the fact that you can transfer promises to pay loans. So he could have done this in a paragraph, but it's Moldbug. So
Moldbug, of course. I mean, why say in a paragraph what you can say in 10? The course of the crisis is a pernicious bit of financial engineering called term transformation. If Neutropians are behaving sensibly, they will avoid term transformation. Neutropians are just people, however, a fat, lonely, pasty-faced people with no life outside their computers, and we can't be too surprised when they do nonsensible things. Why high-powered jock traders on Wall Street were playing the term transforming game is another question entirely, and we'll save it for another day. To understand term transformation, we first need to understand the market for tickets. To understand a market for any good is to understand why it costs what it does. Since all prices are set by supply and demand, we need to know the motivations of the buyers and sellers. Of course, the seller of a ticket can be its original writer, or someone else who bought the ticket and now wants to sell it again. But for simplicity, we'll start by assuming the only participants are the ticket writer and the initial ticket writer. We've defined a ticket so that there are only three variables: the term to maturity, the quantity of calories to deliver, and the identity of the ticket writer. The tendency of the ticket writer determines the probability that the ticket writer will choke before delivering the calories. Assume for the moment, unassume it in a minute, that no ticket writers choke for the same magical risk-free tickets, which cannot exist in nature unless Neutropian's Sadasman changes the rules. We have only two variables, quantity and maturity. We can eliminate the quantity by dividing the current market price P of the ticket in calories by the delivery quantity Q of the ticket in calories. This gives us a nice unitless number P divided by Q. What can we say about this number? I said that for any ticket of any non-zero term, P divided by Q. Oh, why don't you read this, Nicholas? This is all you.
I'm still trying to read it and reread it to figure out what the heck he's talking about. Give me a second. P of the ticket by delivery quantity of the ticket in... Okay. Got it. What can we see about this number? Okay, got it. So it's not like a literal how many tickets sold. They're talking about a quantity in monies of the ticket. I don't know what the delivery quantity means.
Well,
does he mean by that like it's the maturity quantity at the end?
I'll just keep reading and we'll see what he says.
Yeah, this is weird.
I assert that for any ticket of any non-zero term, P divided by Q will be less than 1. Suppose P divided by Q is greater than 1. Then the ticket buyer will be exchanging P calories at time N for Q calories at time M, where P is greater than Q and M greater than N. But since calorie storage is free, she would do better by just holding on to her P calories until M. If P divided by Q is 1, she won't lose, but she won't gain either. Why bother? Since all exchanges require both buyer and seller, none will happen.
Got it. Okay, yeah. So Q, that delivery quantity is... I don't know why he keeps making up new words. Q is just the maturity quantity. It's what's paid out at the end of the loan, basically.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And that's why P over Q has to be less than 1, because what good is it for you to lend out money now to get your money back later, unless there's going to be some utility for you in doing so, right? You need money now. I have it now, but what's in it for me to give it to you now?
Right. And if you end up with the same money at the maturity that you started at the beginning, why loan the money in the first place?
Exactly. You've just volunteered yourself to be out money for some unknown amount of time. Or, well, it's known because there's a contract, but you get the idea.
Right. Now, I just want to interject real here before we keep on going, reading about Moldbug's explanation of the housing crisis. Now, this is the basic libertarian argument. Why would anybody give money to anyone to do something if they don't expect to make as much or more back? This gets down to my argument though when I had with Bob Murphy about defense, because there are certain things you just have to allocate money to that are public goods that do not provide a monetary return, like defense.
Yeah, I mean, on the individual level, I get it. If you're one person with a small amount of money, you're trying to save for retirement, whatever. Your incentives might be different than the public incentives, which is why taxation exists, right? Nobody might want to volunteer to pay money to these projects, and you can't have free riders, and so maybe everybody has to pay a little or something, to make some of these things work, like defense. But at least on the level of individuals, I kind of get what Moldbug is saying. I mean, there's an argument to be made that transactions shouldn't, things shouldn't be so transactional. People should help other people and so on. But if you were just basing an economy on quote rational self-interest and not like, I don't know, Christian Brotherhood or something like that, then this is how you model that economy. One
Sure,
thing to
which is
emphasize
what which is what Moldbug is doing.
yeah, one thing to emphasize about these models is they're not normative aughts. They're just like, here's a way in which we can simplify some part of the world. So
Okay, sure. Where were we? Let's see. Okay, we can define P divided by Q as the discount of the ticket. Then we can use a continuous interest formula to normalize this to an interest rate or yield, which by Neutropian convention is specified not per year, but per day. Life is fast in Neutropia. For any ticket, if we know any two discount, yield, and term, we can compute the third. Thinking in terms of yields rather than discounts does not eliminate the term variable, but it lets us ask a very interesting question. In the Neutropian ticket market, how will yields of tickets with different terms compare? Remember, we are still assuming that no ticket writers choke. The answer is that yields at long terms will be higher. This is not easy to show as the fact that there will be no negative yields, but it's worth working through. To understand why long terms mean higher yields, we have to consider the reason that Neutropians buy and sell tickets in the first place. We are assuming that these instruments will even exist. But why should they? Why is there a market for tickets? A ticket writer is promising to deliver Q equals P plus X calories later in exchange for P calories now. She cannot fulfill this promise without engaging in some activity which is profitable. Please note that this is not a value judgment. It does not make the activity good or bad. It just means that it takes P in calories now and produces P plus X calories at M equals now plus T. In fact, the ticket writer will only write the ticket if she expects her activity to produce Q plus Y calories, because otherwise she makes nothing at all in the deal. Everyone's got to eat. The ticket buyer is exchanging P calories now for Q equals P plus X calories at M. His motivations are simpler. He always has the alternative of storing the P calories until M. But if he uses the ticket instead, he will get more calories. So we have both buyer and seller, and the transaction happens. But what yield does it happen at? The yield is defined by the discount, which is defined by the price of the ticket, which is set by supply and demand among buyers and sellers. Contra most medieval thinkers, there is no just or righteous interest rate derived from the Bible and eternal laws of God. If we want to know what the calorie yield is, we have to actually instantiate Neutropia, and like any price, this yield may change over time. Anything you want to say at this point, Lewis?
no, that all seems pretty straightforward to me.
Okay. And even at any point in time in Nitro City, there's not just one yield. There are many different yields for different terms. In other words, there is a yield curve. We are now ready to see why this curve slopes upward, yields at longer terms are higher. How do you actually turn a profit in Neutropia anyway? Neither the ticket buyer cares at all how this feat is accomplished, but there is one obvious productive process. Neutropians can descend into Yendor, kill monsters, and leave them with their calories and other good stuff. Of course, the monsters fight back, so there is no sure thing. And in order to fight monsters, you need weapons, magic swords, and whatever. So the ticket seller might use P, the calorie she gets for selling a ticket, to rent a magic sword, which she descends to level 15 of Yendor, clears out enough foul orcs, confiscates their calorie cache, and returns to Nitro City, where she returns the sword and pays off her ticket. Well, let's just say that Moldbug's fictional sword-wielding princess didn't go into a Goblin Slayer's universe.
Yeah, right. Well, that's where the risk is going to come in, which you'll get to in a bit.
That's the risk.
Yep.
The ticket is that all this takes time unless you find a way to hack the Neutropian servers. There is no such thing as an instantaneous profitable process. So we can ask in Neutropia, what will the yield be for the 1 second ticket? Unless someone can figure out a way to turn P carries into P plus X carries in 1 second, the yield will be 0. Thus, as we saw, no one will write any such tickets. And if there is some way to profit in 1 second, we can always imagine an epsilon term which is shorter. Thus, the Neutropian yield curve intercepts 0 term at 0 yield, regardless of the details of Neutropia. We can generalize this observation by noting that there are always more kinds of longer productive processes than shorter ones. If you want to descend to the level 417 of Yendor and take on the evil dragon Angstrom, it will take you 3 weeks round trip, whereas if all you are doing is heading down to 113 to knock off some random ogre, you could do it in a week. But a ticket master can construct the equivalent of a 3-week dragon slaying expedition by stringing 3 1-week ogre whacking trips back to back. Because it takes just 3 weeks to slay a dragon, there is no way for the profitable process of dragon slaying to affect the market for 1-week tickets. The converse, however, is not the case. There is no law that says that dragon slaying has to be more profitable than ogre whacking. However, if it is not at least as profitable as ogre whacking, no one will slay dragons. If ticket buyers still want 3-week tickets, ogre slayers will sell them 3 ogre tickets. The short-term yield is a floor for the long-term yield. The Neutropian yield curve can be flat, but it cannot invert. In theory, there may be no profitable processes at all in Neutropia. For example, suppose there are no calories or goodies at all in Yendor. The yield curve will start at the origin and remain there. In practice, any world complex enough to be any fun at all, virtual or real, will have a long-term processes that are more profitable than their short-term counterparts. Because any short-term process can produce long-term tickets, but the converse is not the case. There will be more sellers at later maturities, and the extra competition will push up yields. Now it's time to relax the unrealistic assumption that killing monsters is risk-free. Obviously, it is anything but. Monsters have teeth and claws, they bite and scratch. They shoot fireballs and crush your bones in their huge armored pincers. If you never return from Yendor, not only do you not fulfill your promises, you have no assets to liquidate the monsters to keep it all. This is tricky because suddenly comparing tickets written by different monster hunters is comparing apples to oranges. Wall Street seems to have real trouble with this concept, but assessing risks is always a matter of subjective opinion. How do you know whether a hunter will return? You don't. How do you know her probability of returning? You won't guess. Well, no, if it's Goblin Slayer, you could actually put a quantity on that, Logos.
Kinda. I'm still waiting for season 2.
So you guess, let's say you think your ticket seller has a 97% chance of coming back. Then the expected value of her ticket is not Q, but Q times 0.97. This simply lowers the price P that you are willing to pay for the ticket so that you can calculate objectively. We still define the discount as PQ. The risk of choking simply appears as a higher yield. But wait, for most of us, a 97% chance of Q is not at all the same thing as a 100% chance of Q times 0.97. Risk tolerance, subjective and nonlinear. This creates a market for risk dispersal. If you, the ticket buyer, want a 100% chance of a Q times 0.97 yield, there is no way to achieve it. Uncertainty cannot be converted into certainty. However, you can produce a much more desirable probability distribution by buying not one ticket from one hunter with a 97% chance of returning, but 100 slices of 1/100th of a ticket from each of the 100 hunters, each of whom has a 97% chance. A tricky transaction. At this point, the ticket buyer, are attempting to just let your calories sit around under the mattresses. But there is an alternative. You can buy one ticket from a ticket balancer who in turn deals with 100 ticket buyers and 100 ticket selling hunters. The balancer does not hunt herself. She does not go anywhere near the Yendor. She buys 100 tickets of Q calories with 1-week terms from hunters who she estimates have a 97% chance of returning. She then sells 100 tickets of 0.97 times Q calories to risk-averse buyers. Since the buyers are risk-averse, by definition, they accept lower yields. Then she pays the hunters and she profits. As described, the balancer's risk of choking is quite high, but maintaining a small buffer of, say, 10 times Q calories will make it very low due to the law of large numbers. What does the ticket buyer need to know in order to buy a ticket written by a balancer? He needs to know that A, the balancer will not wander into Yendo and get knocked off by an orc herself, and B, the balancer holds enough tickets with sufficient expected value, plus some buffer to have a high probability of delivering on the ticket she has written. There are no risk-free tickets in Neutropia, but a balancer can reduce risk to an arbitrarily low epsilon, of course at the price of lower yield. Thus, the balancer must submit to the restrictions and disclosures in order to write tickets which are perceived as low risk, rather than forcing every buyer of her tickets to do his own due diligence. She will probably hire an auditor who will inspect her restrictions and disclosures and testify to her credibility. The auditor is then responsible for maintaining its own credibility in the eye of the public ticket buyer. Well, right, because in real life logos, banks love auditors, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, what Moldbug's describing here for the audience is just insurance. The idea that you can have somebody, it's basically like an investment firm or an index, some general fund that will buy lots of stocks, which may have some risk. But the idea is, instead of you buying stocks directly, assuming all the risk yourself, you invest in the index with the idea that some of the stocks the index invests in won't do well. Some may do better. On average, you get about a promised return. And this is, Warren Buffett swears by certain indices and stuff like that, just for this reason. Some people love to play the risk and reward of, stock market, buy low, sell high, ride the wave, gamble, all that good stuff. Wall Street Bets is all about the gamble on stocks. But if you're risk averse, like he's just describing how you can invest in an index to really smooth out that risk.
Right. Okay, this concludes our discussion of normal healthy finance in Neutropia. Note that we have not mentioned equity, i.e. stock. Our tickets are bonds, zero coupon bonds to be exact. Briefly, a more sophisticated financial system would replace one-size-fits-all liquidation procedure with different priorities of tickets, where high priority tickets are paid off truly early if the ticket writer chokes and thus earns lower yield. Stock is a sort of zero priority ticket for especially funky hunting expeditions whose return is widely unpredictable. Its holders get no fixed payment at all, just whatever's left over after everyone else is paid, which could be huge or it could be nothing at all. Now it's time to transform some terms. Term transformation, this vice goes by another name, which are easier to Google, but let's keep the suspense for a little while. Happens when a ticket balancer buys tickets which mature later than tickets she writes. At first, term transformation seems to make no sense at all. Then it makes perfect sense. Then you see what a truly awful idea it is. Recall that in our explanation of ticket balancing, our balancer bought a 1-week tickets for hunters who were going on a 1-week expedition, i.e. whacking ogres. She then sold 1-week tickets to her buyers, and the whole thing works out perfectly. Her hunters, or at least most of them, come back with their calories, which she probably delivered, no sweat. Suppose that instead of ogre whackers, our balancer dealt with 3-week dragon slayers. Remember, since the Neutropian yield curve slopes upward, the yield on dragon slaying is higher than the yield on ogre whacking. In other words, dragon slaying is more profitable per week than ogre whacking. Not because dragons are wealthier than ogres, though they are, but just because if it wasn't, no one would bother slaying dragons. Thus, term transformation is an obvious way for the balancer to pocket a little extra scratch. She is still paying 1-week yields, but she is earning 3-week yields. But there's a problem. When her ticket holders come back in a week, what does she say? We've had some bad weather and the ogres are unexpectedly recalcitrant. Also, exactly, I was just heading out. Can I call you tomorrow? I'm sure we'll get this whole thing cleared up. This might fly in the real world, but not in Neutropia, whose ice-cold, iron-hard laws enforced not by mere flesh, but by merciless and inexorable software. As if you couldn't hack it, right? Goes.
Yeah.
As soon as the balancer breaks her first promise, she's locked out of her account and her assets go straight to the block. Ouch. Well, except that doesn't actually happen with a lot of crypto businesses.
Well, yeah, that's why this is a very, very simplified model.
Yeah. So how can term transformation happen? It seems that we are trying to teleport calories not through space, but backward through time. Even in Neutropia, there is just no way to convert tomorrow's calories into today's calories. Besides, as we've seen, balancers need to be audited, and even if our balancer is so foolish as to think she can pull calories magically out of the future, no auditor could conceivably agree. We cannot understand term transformation without looking at the motives of the buyer. After all, the auditor exists only because the buyer demands this service. If the buyer accepts that term, transformation is good and sweet and true, surely the auditor will agree. First, we notice that since the balancer is, after all, earning a higher yield from her dragon slayers, she can pay a higher yield to her customers. What will happen in practice is that she will split the profit with them. So the balancer wins and the ticket buyers win. In fact, since term transformation creates a higher demand for long-term tickets, thus driving down the yield, if not quite to ogre whacking levels, the dragon slayers win. 2, everyone wins. It's a win-win-win situation, and at least if we can solve this pesky liquidation problem. Second, we notice that liquidation is not as bad as it seems, especially in Notropia, where the process is fully automated and demands no ridiculous periwig judicial official. What matters to the ticket buyers and hence to the auditors is that they get their calories. And since the liquidation process has plenty of assets, the Dragon Slayer tickets to sell, there's no reason at all to think that the ticket buyers will take a haircut. Quite the contrary, in fact. Remember that to deal with the vagaries of monster hunting, any balancer must maintain a small calorie buffer to get on the good side of the law of large numbers. With this buffer, plus the proceeds from selling the Dragon Slayer tickets on the open market, the ticket buyers may even profit when the balancer chokes. Of course, this makes no sense. Liquidation cannot be profitable. If liquidation is profitable, there's no need to liquidate. Ergo, the balancer herself can just sell the Dragon Slayer tickets, using the proceeds to redeem the tickets she has written. She has thus earned a week of Dragon Slayer yield, not ogre whacker yield, and has come out ahead. Everyone still wins. Thus, the auditor doesn't need to worry at all about the term of the balancer's assets. The auditor can just verify that the total present market price in calories, of course, of the assets meets or exceeds the number of calories the balancer is obliged to deliver. As long as this criterion, which we can call scalar solvency, is met, there is no problem. Furthermore, this idea that the balancer's customers all show up after a week and start pounding on the doors, demanding their calories, is not at all realistic. We have spent a considerable amount of effort in understanding the motives of ticket writers. We need to tell more about the end buyers. Okay, so anything you want to say here, Logos? I think we know where he's going with this.
Yeah, nothing really to say.
I think here's the operative word. Let's see. The idea that the balancer's customers all show up after a week and start pounding on the doors, demanding their calories, is not all realistic. That is, I think he's using that as a signal for like the idea of a run of the bank.
Yeah, or a run on the investment firm. Like usually when people put money in investment firms, they don't come in expecting this money returns exactly in a week or something like that. A lot of people that invest money will just stick it in there, and especially the old idea of finance was just leave it in there long term and see what the gains will be. So
we just got Charlie in the chat. He says he needs some summaries. So you already gave a summary. Can you give another summary for what we just read?
Moldbug is using a toy model to describe. He says not stocks, although it's not too much different aside from what Moldbug says, the variable output of stocks. He's just talking about bonds, and really he's going to talk about loans because the recession's about like mortgages specifically. So indices, loans, mortgages, all that. So the idea is you've got people that will that need loans. So you want to buy a house. So his example was, I want to go monster slaying. I need to rent a weapon. So I'm going to, loan some, borrow some money out to rent a weapon, go kill monsters, give the renter back money for the weapon or the weapon itself, give the lender back some agreed upon term of interest. I keep some proceeds. And so the idea is you have profitable stuff that happens over time. You have lendable money and, supply and demand hookup. That's basically the first part of the summary. Then he argues that long-term loans should pay better than short-term loans because, well, there's ignoring risk for a second. If there was no assumed greater yield in long-term loans, nobody'd make them. Everything would just be a degree of short-term loans. He used the example of like ogre and dragon slaying, right? If slaying ogres in 1 week was the most profitable thing to do, everybody'd consider a waste of time to hunt dragons in an expedition that takes 3 weeks. You just have 3 1-week ogre runs. And in real life, this is basically the idea. Why would people agree to lend you money for 3 months or 3 years or 30 years if it was less profitable than lending it to you for like say 10 years? And of course, if you just use like the simple or the compound interest formula with E and stuff, it's like, of course, like the longer the loan goes out, the more interest you're going to owe on it. It's exponential math. And then now he's introducing risk, the idea that, well, not all loans, not all bonds, sometimes stuff, falls through the cracks. Most of the time it works, obviously, because the system doesn't crash on a daily basis. And so he says, well, suppose 97% of it works. Well, now we've got these people who act as like insurance for finance, really. They're like index funds, where a whole bunch of people put all their money in. And because you have a whole bunch of money this investor has to act as a bulwark to buy like a whole bunch of these like tickets, these loans, um, if some of the loans fall through the floor, it won't be a big deal, right? So if 97% of them fall through the floor, you don't have one person buying a loan and that whole loan goes belly up, making them lose all the money. What you have is you have for every 100 loans bought, 97 of them still work and give you a bunch of interest. 3% of them don't work, you lose interest. And everybody still makes good overall, so everybody kind of splits the profits and so on and so forth. It's basically loaning insurance through an index fund or something like that. Now what he's talking about is this phenomena where it's actually quite interesting. So let's suppose you have people give you a bunch of money for 1 week loans, and you start doing that. But then what happens is, as you start getting payments back from those 1 week loans, instead of, giving everything back to your investors immediately, what you do is you start slowly liquidating those gains into 3 week loans, the more profitable ones over the long term, unbeknownst to your investors. He calls that term transference, where you start taking gains from short loans, and instead of just paying out the risk averse way as people demand, you keep investing them in longer and longer and longer term loans, trying to either take a little bit off the top if people are none the wiser. If they are the wiser, say, okay, yeah, I reinvest it in this longer term loan, but it's totally going to help you out. No big deal. And what he's going to go into here, he's transitioning to is some of the risks involved in that sort of behavior. Because the idea is, think of it this way. It's like if you gamble on one batch of loans and 3% of them can go belly up, you're still working. But let's suppose you keep transferring your money and like doubling down in a sense, using like a gambling analogy, right? So it's like instead of paying out, seeing what you want to do with your money and then reinvesting some of it and taking the payout and whatever, let's suppose you just keep doubling down and reinvesting that money. Well, you're going to have 97% work, 97% work, 97% work, right? And so there's going to be like this stochastic math that kind of works out where you're losing 3% every iteration. The other thing with that as well is that he's going to point out here, I think he's trying to, is this whole thing works on a bulwark. He even used that word, like a bulwark of money, like an insurance company. You have to have a cushion of cash on hand to meet your losses if more losses than you expect happen. If you only expect 3% of things to go belly up and like 8% of things go belly up, you either have the cash on hand to absorb that or you go under, basically, is what happens. And part of the problem with this term transference thing is if you don't use the returns from the successful loans you counted on to store up your cash in case things in the future go belly up, if you immediately just dump all those winnings into new investments, you're going to start losing your bulwark. And then eventually, if too many things go belly up, you're going to get caught with your pants down. And that's basically kind of where we're at right now.
Okay. Why do buyers buy 1 week tickets rather than 3 week tickets? Given that the latter produce a higher yield, it can only be because they feel they might need their calories in 1 week rather than 3. Perhaps they will, perhaps they won't. The future is full of uncertainty. But if buyers knew what they would exchange their calories for next week, it is very likely that they would exchange them now. They lose a week's yield, they gain a week's use of whatever. But Nootropians hold calories in other calorie tickets rather than magic swords because they are not sure they want to buy in the future, and when they want to go buy it, and because calories cost nothing to store, they are a good choice for a rainy day fun. So it's very likely that the balancers ticket holders, when they get their calories back in a week, will simply want to buy another week's ticket. The rainy day has not arrived. The calories go back in the kitty. We call this rolling over the ticket. Rolling over is quite convenient for everyone concerned. If all her buyers roll over, as they may well, the balancer does not have to sell any Dragon Slayer tickets before their time. She can make this even easier by stipulating that by default her tickets roll over. If one of her customers really wants his calories after 1 week, the request will of course be satisfied promptly and courteously. If all the customers demand redemption, there will perhaps be a little more of a Chinese fire drill as Dragon Slayer tickets are sold, but the balancer maintains a comfortable margin of scalar solvency so everyone's ticket is redeemed. Furthermore, now that we've made term transformation work so well, what is this whole week thing about? The number no longer bears any resemblance to anything. We have long since given up on the ogre whacking. The ogre axe has been beaten to dragon swords. Surely, rather than insisting that her customers wait a whole week whenever they want their calories, she can shorten the term to, say, a day or an hour. Or, in fact, the magic of term transformation has solved a problem that we didn't think was solvable at all. It produced a yield on a zero-term ticket. As we adopt automatic rollover and we adjust the term of the balancer's tickets down to epsilon, term transformation creates a fabulous new construct, the demand ticket. The demand ticket is an instrument that pays the bearer a quantity Q of calories on demand. It is just like holding calories, only better. Because until you actually demand your calories, your demand ticket produces a yield. No more in and out of orc mugging yield either, but the maximum bona fide long-term dragon slaying yield. Sometimes the dragon wins, of course, and we have to subtract that, and the balancer, like everyone, needs to eat. But overall, term transformation produces a win for everyone. The end buyer gets a maximum yield and total flexibility, the balancer gets more of a taste, the auditor still has to audit, and the dragon slayer gets more investment at better rates. Perhaps the ogre whackers aren't too happy, but they'll have to bring their game up to the point where it's as profitable as dragon slaying. If that can't be done, perhaps the ogre ecosystem could use a bit of a rest anyway. And aren't we the brave hunters of Neutropia, stronger and better men and women if we pit all our sinews against the noblest of beasts, the dragon? Alas, if only true. If term transformation really did work, not just Neutropia, but indeed the whole world would be a cleaner, shinier, happier place. I'm afraid it's quite inarguable that if the Americans and Europeans of 1908 could see their countries now, they would be both amazed at the achievements of science and engineering and appalled at how shabby, filthy, ugly, and dangerous their great cities had become. If you can't imagine what this could possibly have to do with term transformation, I understand, but I'll get there. So what is the problem? What could possibly be the problem? In the above defense of term transformation, which I do hope is not a straw man, I really did throw in every argument I have heard of or can think of, and if readers know of any others, they should feel free to append. They are very subtle but extremely fatal holes. Okay, but before he goes into that, do you want to say anything about term transformation, Logos?
No, I think I just had it in the summary I gave to Charlie.
Okay, cool. First, let's introduce the concept of financial hygiene. Financial hygiene is a lot like regular hygiene. If you are the only one who goes around licking doorknobs, you are unlikely to catch diseases from doorknobs. But if you find yourself licking doorknobs, it's probably not an idea you, being a sensible person, came up with yourself, which means that other people are probably doing it too. So financial hygiene is a criteria for prudent herd behavior. A strategy is financially hygienic if the strategy works just as well, whether a whole herd adopts it or just a maverick individual. As we'll see, term transformation is to hygienic finance as a pile of oil-soaked rags is to a sanitary napkin. Term transformation is a great idea so long as no one else is doing it. Well, we'll start by going back to our magical risk-free tickets. What's truly amazing is that term transformation is so dangerous that even when all tickets are risk-free, it can detonate instantly without warning. Mind you, risk does not make the problem any better. In fact, it makes it much worse. But first things first. With risk-free tickets, we no longer need the services of our balancer. Instead, ordinary ticket buyers can transform their own terms. This does not make the problem worse, but it makes it easier to see. In Nitro City, where all transactions are frictionless, why in the world would anyone hold calories? If long-term tickets are risk-free, keeping your calories under the mattress or even a millisecond is just throwing away calories. Just hold the longest-term tickets with the highest yield until you're ready to spend your calories. Then instead of exchanging calories for stuff, exchange your long-term tickets for calories and immediately exchange for stuff. With this strategy, you're always earning maximum yield, or will it? It's not clear that the yield will be all that great. After all, when everyone is buying long-term tickets, how much can they yield? And let's not even start on the consequences for the dragon ecology. Presumably the beasts are apex predators after all, but there is a worse problem. The problem is that when you buy a ticket of term P, you are signaling the market that you intend to exchange calories now for calories at now plus T. This demand is naturally satisfied by a dragon slayer who commits to the opposite exchange.
Okay, before you go on for a second, I want to give a little summary for what he's talking about. Like, why is it a problem that everybody buys a ticket, and what does this have to do with the yield? The idea with these bonds is how they work is you say, look, I'm looking for a loan, and treat the interest rate on the loan as kind of like the price for a loan. If nobody wants to take you up on your loan, you have to kind of like raise the interest rate until somebody says, okay, I'll take the risk on you because the interest is good. So let's say you start at like 1% interest, and like everybody's like, I'm not going to do it for that. You get a 2%, you get a 3%, you get a 4%. You keep going until you get to like 8%. Somebody goes, snatch, I'm going to take that thing. Mine, good. I'll take that loan for you. Well, the idea is if everybody is just looking to liquidate their cash for easy interest 24/7, then what's going to happen is, okay, imagine this game where that if you can get like good percents, let's say around 4, 5, 6%, you're going to be doing pretty well for yourself. If you can keep riding that train, it's going to be awesome for you, right? But but you have a risk because other people are seeing that too. And so as you're bidding up, will you take it for 1? Will you take it for 2? Will you take it for 3? Will you take it for 4? Sure, and then before you can finish, somebody else swipes it from you, right? They win the auction, they bid it first. So what do? Well, now maybe you go, okay, maybe next time we'll take it at 3.5, right? So you bid at 3.5 to stop somebody else from taking it first at 4. But now everybody knows that, oh, they're taking it at 3.5. I want to stop them from swiping it from me at 3.5, so I'll take it at 3. And so that's a natural way in which higher demand for loan buyers rather than people to be lent to. If there are more people wanting to give out loans to people, that's why interest rates can go lower, because the people wanting the loans can either be choosy and take the ones that give the lowest interest rates, or B, you can have an auction system where people will snatch loans up at lower rates just to make sure they get some returns over their competitors.
Right. If this is not really the transaction you intended to perform, you are sending a false signal. When you send a false signal, you should not be surprised to get an ugly result. When you send a false signal as part of an entire herd, which is sending the same false signal, you should be surprised not to get an ugly result. Our fallacy in designing this wonderful edifice of term transformation was to assume that it is possible for an unlimited number of parties to signal a market in one direction without affecting the market price. In other words, we are committing the most common error in economics by assuming an objective or absolute price. Of course, there is no such thing. All prices are set by supply and demand, and if you add sellers to a market without adding buyers, the price will go down. Let me slip briefly into the language of normal Windowsological finance. To buy a ticket of term T is to lend for a period of term T. To sell a ticket of term T is to borrow for that period, and these same terms apply whether or not you are an original buyer or seller of the ticket. So when you buy a ticket of term T, but you really intend to be able to sell your money at T divided by 2 or T divided by 6, whatever the heck you feel like it, or need to, you are assuming that you will be able to find another lender at T divided by 2 or T divided by 6, or whenever you will acquire your loan. For example, an equivalent transaction is to write your own ticket at T divided by 6 with a term of 5T divided by 6 and sell it. You keep the original ticket, and it produces its proceeds to T to pay off the ticket you wrote. Don't try this at home, kids. If everyone who lends at term T really intends to lend at term T, then few individuals whose plans turn out differently will have no problem in correcting their mistake. People's actions may differ from their plans, but they are likely to at least cluster symmetrically around them. However, if every single Neutropian who lent at N for term T really intended to lend for an extreme and unrealistic example, let's say T divided by 6 minus when N plus T divided by 6 rolls around, the market for 5T divided by 6 tickets will become kind of nasty. There'll be quite a few sellers and no buyers at all. In the Nitro City ticket market on N plus T divided by 6 for tickets maturing at T, the yield will be immense and the price will be derisory. This is the opposite of financial hygiene, financial contagion. Our herd of Neutropians all thought they would earn a Dragon Slayer yield on an Orc Hunter schedule. Well, they did earn a Dragon Slayer yield until the market opened at N plus T divided by 6. Then they saw a picture that looked rather like this, and then suddenly realized that they had no yield at all but massive losses, and all this with 100% risk-free tickets. The example of everyone selling at N plus T divided by 6 is slightly exaggerated, but it's less exaggerated than you might think for a couple of reasons. First, the whole point of a rainy day fund is to have a stash of calories for a rainy day, and a rainy day by definition rains on everyone. Second, when the curve starts to head for Antarctica, everyone who has these N plus T tickets sees the light and wants out ASAP. This is called a panic. Historically speaking, the association between financial panics and term transformation is about as solid as the association between smallpox and the smallpox virus. Although I suppose you do have to have the smallpox virus to get smallpox. Whether panics can, in theory, be caused by any other widespread error in planning that mimics term transformation. For example, the sudden discovery of an asteroid that was about to hit Neutropia at n plus t divided by 2 could certainly have a rather dramatic effect on the yield curve. On the other hand, if there are any cases of financial panics in history, they were not associated with term transformation, and I'm not aware of them. Perhaps readers will be so kind as to enlighten me. Now let's put this risk and balance back in and see how it changes the game. Now, not for the better, as you can imagine. If you scroll back up to our rosy explanation of how well term transformation works, you can see how the same error infects the case with the risk and balancer. And at every step of the process, we're assuming that another buyer can be found for the ticket at the same pleasant prices. Of course, this is not so at all. The balancer just adds a layer of indirection to the same basic process of breakdown and panic. The result is an even more speculated train wreck. In a way, it's almost beautiful, unless, of course, you're in it. Using the familiar logic of financial hygiene, we can assume that in a market where term transformation is active, our one poor balancer will not be the only agent performing risk dispersal for the Dragon Slayer market. Rather, we need to consider the entire category of balancers in this space as the herd. The panic can start in many ways, but the simplest is a wave of redemption in demand tickets. There is no way to predict this wave because by replacing true tickets with demand tickets, the term transferring balancers have essentially jammed a price signal. They have no idea what the future pattern of demand ticket redemption will look like, either with their own customer base or across Neutropia as a whole. To redeem the demand tickets they have written, the balancers must in turn sell Dragon Slayer tickets. Of course, this drives the Dragon Slayer yield up and the price down. The result is the balancers enter scalar insolvency. The total market price and present calories of the tickets they own, plus their calorie buffers, no longer extends the sum in present calories of their current obligations. So the owners of their demand tickets will take a haircut. They strive to avoid this in the usual way by withdrawing ASAP. The early bird gets the worm, flat bird flap. But to even calculate this haircut, to liquidate the balancers and pay their creditors, more Dragon Slayer tickets need to be sold. So the price drops even further. Eventually, someone realizes that the ordinary vanilla untransformed financial hygienic demand for calories at N plus T continues to exist and puts a floor under the market, and there are buyers again, if there is still an Neutropia to buy them in. This nasty process is a feedback loop between the Dragon Slayer tickets and the institutions that own them and the customers to whom they are obligated. It can be triggered by any unexpected pattern of selling anywhere in the circle. For example, if Dragon Slayer attrition rates starts going from 3% to 5% to 7% to 15% to 20%, perhaps because demand for Dragon Slayer tickets has been so high that all kinds of completely unqualified warriors decide to rent a sword and descend into Yendor in search of dragons, the same thing will happen. Well, let's just stop here for a moment, Logos. Wouldn't this situation mean that ogre tickets go sky high?
Would it make ogre tickets go sky high?
Well, because assuming that this transfer isn't happening with the ogre tickets, unless they're brought in to prop this up, they would be sky high, right?
Yeah, basically. I mean, this is kind of happening now. It's funny how he's writing this back in 2007, but people are commenting on this exact pattern happening right now because what happened was we have these bond yields, let's say. The banks are buying, right? The Fed, banks, everything, they're buying our bonds at a certain rate of interest. But if inflation starts going up faster than the interest on the bonds, you have an issue where you're making less money on the interest of the bond than you're losing due to inflation. You've actually kind of like lost money on this long-term asset, which is one of the reasons why the government has this big incentive to get inflation down, because rampant inflation kills investment. Okay, so the government, tries to attack inflation, but what does the Fed do? The Fed raises interest rates. And so when the Fed raises interest rates, what happens is if you bought bonds for, I don't know, like 3% interest or whatever crazy thing you buy interest for, and the Fed's like, yeah, now we're increasing the floor of interest basically to like 4% or 5%. Well, your 3% interest bonds are now terrible compared to like the 4 or 5% bonds are coming out with to help fight inflation. But that makes it really hard to sell your 3% bond. So let's say you acquired a bunch of 3% bonds, and you were going to attempt to sell them and some of their yields later to invest in other bonds and try to do this time transfer thing. This inflation stuff happened, this 4% bond stuff happened. Your 3% bonds now become worthless. Well, not totally. You can still probably sell them for something, but they're worth a heck of a lot less than you bought them for, given the new standard is 4 or 5%. But you still have to cover your costs, so you have to sell them for something. And so what happens is you sell the bonds you bought, and you just eat a turd sandwich basically, because you're just out a whole bunch of money. And this is basically the commentary around the bank failures that are happening right now in the country. So
yeah. Next week, we'll look at how unhygienic finance in the real world and just how and when it got to be so popular. Clearly, what we have here is a case of regulatory failure. And this is another piece of Reagan-era napkin economics coming back to haunt us like a bad burrito. Did Hillary do it with her cattle fortune futures, or is it one of those New Deal things? When will it not be all FDR all the time here at UR? If you don't know, please take a ticket and come back next Thursday. And do avoid the comments if you truly cherish your suspense, because I assume someone will spill the beans. Okay, interesting. So he's going to draw this one out. Wow, you ready for this one, Logos?
Sure, why not?
Okay, we'll try to fit one more in. An open letter to Ron Paul supporters. So this is going to be the first of his open letters, I guess. January the 10th, 2008. Ron Paul is wonderful. He is the best thing to happen in all American politics in my lifetime. I will vote for Dr. Paul. I think anyone eligible should do likewise, but I have some questions for my fellow Paulistas. Suppose Ron Paul is elected president. What makes you think that President Paul can fix the U.S. federal government? What makes you think that any president can fix the U.S. federal government? What makes you think that the U.S. federal government can be fixed at all? And if you don't think it can be fixed, what do you hope to achieve by voting in its elections? Obviously, it all depends what you mean by fixed. But obviously, if you support Ron Paul, you think said institution, which down on the Potomac oft assumes the snappy name of USG, not to be confused with U.S. Gypsum, maker of fine sheetrock in a desperate need of an extreme makeover. When Barry Obama talks about change, he's talking about a whole new brand of lipstick, a deep, restoring facial, and maybe even a few collagen shots. With Dr. Paul, the bone saw is given. We're probably looking at a full maxillary reconstruction, a few rounds of chemo, and perhaps a silver nose like Tycho Brahe's. Assuming all goes well, our new old republic, meticulously recreated from 200-year-old dental records, will resemble the present USG about as much as the latter looks like US Gypsum. All the better, you say. If your problem is an invasive sphenoid tumor, your solution is not blush and mascara. Our beloved republic is sick, deeply sick. She needs the procedure, and in Dr. Paul, the man, the hour, and the wrong viewer have met, but have they? At this point, the smooth, Grima-esque voice of the moderate mainstream libertarian may be heard, suggesting that Dr. Paul is unelectable. Ergo, it will not help to vote for Dr. Paul because Dr. Paul will not be elected. And your precious vote will be wasted. Rather, if you want to work for real change, you should work within the system. Well, we think we know where we're going with Moldbug here. That's his whole MO, isn't it?
Yep.
So Ron Paul's unelectable, guys. Those Dark Elves. Yeah, I trust those. So he's been on this Dark Elf kick.
He has.
Okay, this is 2007. We noticed this. This is 2007. So for 16 years. Well, August, how long do we have to wait for the Dark Elves to do something?
Another 16 years. Trust the plan.
Oh, man. Of course, there are only so many desks at the Cato Institute to go around, but if you make your small voice heard, maybe there will be more. Who says libertarians can't have their own Beltway patronage machine? Uncle Sam beams down benevolently on friend and foe alike. As are Orwell's classic, the two are never far from common ground. Needless to say, here at UR, we have no truck with these shills. Remind me of the most typical of the House dissident, like Grigory Arbatov, the flourish sold in the late Soviet period. But yes, if I had to bet, I would bet that Ron Paul will not be elected in 2008. I don't think he will even win the Republican nomination. Okay, Moldbug was right on those 2 points. We'll give him that, right, Lucas?
Yeah.
He was right about that. But would I realistically rule it out? fashion is fickle, even intellectual fashion. In a democracy, intellectual fashion rules. The age of viral politics is upon us. Is all that stands between Dr. Paul and the White House the right YouTube spot or two? Well, in light of Trump, that might actually be true.
Mm-hmm.
Who the heck knows? Frankly, kids these days baffle me. And even if Dr. Paul doesn't win this year, there will be other years and other Ron Pauls, as Todd CV points out. I'm not even going to start on this NS crap. I refer you to my post on the subject. Anyone who starts playing the Kevin Bacon game with Ron Paul and Mustache Man, or anyone in Mustache Man, is required to submit to the same exact experiment with Stalin and Mao, and is specifically enjoined from using the term McCarthyism for so long as they live. You really don't have any shame, do you? So again, even if Ron Paul or someone like him in 2012 or 2016 or 2020, 2016 logos, that's kind of what happened. Some dark horse guy got elected in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Will he be able to fix the USG? Dr. Paul has described his program very eloquently and straightforwardly. He wants to restore the Constitution of 1789, or at least this is how he describes it, although probably a better match for the actual platform would be the Constitution of 1889, but no matter, next to the present situation, the difference is small. Let's assume our goal is to achieve this result. We would like to convert USG into something which at least bears some vague resemblance to the structure described in the Constitution of 1789, plus, of course, its duly ratified amendments to the present date, interpreted according to their original public meeting. Obviously, no one person can achieve this goal. We, the set of people who would prefer this state of affairs to the present state of affairs, will have to act collectively. The question is voting for Ron Paul or someone like him an effective collective strategy for producing this result, assuming we have sufficient votes to elect Dr. Paul as president? Well, we know what Moldbug's going to say, but it would work if the guy's name was Donald Trump. Actually, this is not a question for me. I know the answer. At least I think I know the answer. Perhaps I'm wrong, but if so, I feel quite confident in my error. And so my actual question is about you, my fellow Ron Paul supporters. Are you voting for, and even better, donating to this Paul campaign because you seriously believe that if Dr. Paul is elected, he will actually be able to carry out his extreme makeover bonesaw program? If so, let me put it as gently as possible. You have no idea what you're up against. But why shouldn't you believe me? Perhaps I'm just another enemy of freedom. Surely there are many such, and perhaps I am one. So let's start by looking at what we can agree on. Since we are Ron Paul supporters, we agree that USG is not, in fact, the organization described by the Constitution of 1789. You have all heard Dr. Paul's spiel. I have no need to repeat it. In other words, USG operates under an unwritten constitution. To Americans, this sounds paradoxical, sacrilegious, or both. In fact, it is perfectly normal. Under an unwritten constitution, there is one sovereign legislative institution which holds the ultimate power of government, and whose authority cannot be legally disobeyed. The law is whatever the body says the law is. In the UK, this institution is Parliament. In the US, it is the Supreme Court. USG's unwritten constitution consists of a series of Supreme Court precedents, many of which date to the 1930s. Footnote 4 is perhaps the best example. These are simply laws expressed as judicial decisions. Generally, they are very vague and broad. Then Congress writes its own laws within these boundaries. Generally, they are quite vague and broad. Then the various agencies and other arms of USG write regulations within the boundaries defined by Congress. Generally, these are quite detailed and specific, and this is how the sausage is made. If you don't like it, you can, of course, petition the Supreme Court. If that isn't legislative sovereignty, what is? Of course, USG is particular in having a written constitution to go with its unwritten one. This has required our rulers to bend their decrees sinuously around the text of this ancient document, an exercise which at least serves to remind us of Mr. Swift's tale of a tub. As for the claim that Americans are free from whereas Britons live in chains because we have a written constitution and they are subject to the rulers' every passing whim, I will have to respectfully disagree. I have never lived in Britain, but I gather the main difference is that they drive on the other side of the road. Written constitutions were an experiment. The data are in, the experiment has failed. If Dr. Paul would prefer USG to return to the constitutional interpretation of 1789 or 1889 or 1926 or whatever, he is, of course, free to say so. And I agree, certainly compared to the USG we have today, the structure of 1789 strikes me as quite appealing. But why should we assume that if Dr. Paul managed to return the U.S. to the Constitution of 1789, it would stay that way? We once had a constitution.
That's a relevant argument.
Yeah, especially in light of all your shenanigans with what's his name?
James Lindsay.
James Lindsay. Apparently, you're a Christian nationalist now. By the way, good for you.
Yeah, he also blocked me finally. That was fun.
So maybe you need to change your Twitter handle to Christian nationalist logos.
I'm going to ignore this blasphemy to Marcus this one time.
We once had a constitution of 1799, then stuff happened, and now we don't. Does that sound like a success to you? Let's call this the first crack in the convince everyone to vote for Ron Paul's strategy for fixing USG. We are still assuming that President Paul can perform the surgery, but will the wound stay closed and will it heal properly? Does the Constitution of 1789 protect us against the possibility that the tumor will just grow back? Perhaps quite a bit faster than it took to grow in the first place. What we're questioning here is the commonly held but thoroughly fallacious concept of limited government. I agree that limited government is desirable. I see no reason or to believe that it is implementable. Note the curious use of the passive voice in this construction. How can a sovereign authority limit its own power? If it decides to change its mind and take the power back, who will exactly stop it?
Exactly. Yep.
For me, 200 mpg carburetors and written constitutions which limit the power of the state are all in the same category. I think they would be great to have. I will believe that they exist when I not only see them working, but understand how it is that they could possibly work. I recognize that both these tests are very difficult. If you wanted to start by passing just one, my inbox is always open. But I would argue that converse problem exists. If you want to be God Emperor who has absolute total power, good luck with that. How long does that last?
Mm-hmm. It's true.
Not very long. You know, some civil war, some court intrigue, whatever. One sad effect of this mania for government limited constitutions is that it has obscured the previous meaning of the word constitution, which is actually much more useful. In normal 18th century English, the constitution of a government or any other institution just meant its persistent organizational structure. The term was not prescriptive but descriptive. For example, John Adams' Defense of the Constitutions of the United States, well worth a read, by the way, uses the word in the good old descriptive sense, an actual defense of the Constitution of the present USG, which strained the powers of Lucifer, let alone John Adams. But I would still find it quite an interesting read. Of course, you would need the Constitution first. For example, our written prescriptive Constitution says nothing at all about the press, except, of course, that it shall be free, whatever that means. But is it really possible to construct a descriptive Constitution of USG without mentioning the official press? The Times and the Post alone are institutions at least as influential and durable as many formal government agencies. Their power, such as the right to publish leaks, are thoroughly embedded in both law and custom. They are not even mentioned in the Constitution. How descriptive can it be? And when we ask ourselves what President Paul could do to fix USG, which documents should we consult? The written Constitution of 1789, plus amendments of the descriptive Constitution of 2008. Unfortunately, the latter does not exist, but it is our only option. If the Constitution of 1789 determined the answer, would we need a President Paul? Therefore, let's consider the powers of the president in actual USG as it exists. Okay, sometimes I get the impression that many voters actually believe the president is in some sense the leader of his country, as though he was Mean Mr. Mustache or something. If you're operating under this illusion, it's probably too much for me to dispel, but I will try anyway. The actual Constitution of the actual USG as it actually exists today, the president is a relatively minor official whose duties are primarily ceremonial. The office is not utterly impotent like the British monarchy, but give it a century or two. Suppose the product of a presidential election actually was the leader of this country. While the term country in a political discourse is spectacularly meretricious, oscillating between A, a portion of the planet's surface, B, a set of humans of at least hominids, and C, a sovereign corporation or government which exercises sovereign power over A and B. Clearly, the concept of leader makes no sense in the first context, is too scary for words in the second, and can be understood only in the third. Thus, a leader of USG would be a corporate executive, a CEO. This sounds like we're on the right track because we know there is some association between the presidents and something called the executive branch. Perhaps if Dr. Paul was elected president, we could think of him as the CEO of USG. Not a chance. We have slipped away from our actual descriptive constitution and instead find ourselves back in high school civics class, reciting pablum. A CEO of a normal private organization company, nonprofit, etc., controls 4 aspects of the company's operations: budget, policy, structure, and personnel. He or she sets the distribution of funds between units of the institution, tells its employees what to do and how to do it, configures lower level management structures, and can hire and fire individuals at will. Forget Ron Paul for a moment. Imagine if we elect not Dr. Ron Paul, but Steve Jobs as president of the United States. He wouldn't take the job, but imagine if he did. President Jobs would find himself in a rather unaccustomed position. You know, wouldn't it be funny, Logos, if instead, at some point, Moldbug just says, what if we elect Trump as president, as a thought experiment?
Yeah, that'd be pretty funny.
That'd be funny. But Jobs would find himself in a rather unaccustomed position. He could not relocate funds between agencies or even between departments or even between programs. He could not change any organizational structure. He could not tell anyone what to do. He could not fire, promote, or demote any of his employees. What could he do? Look dignified and come across well on TV. Or turn the whole world upside down like Donald Trump. You can do that as president.
Oh, you absolutely can fire a bunch of employees as president.
True, too.
I mean, you know, that the House kind of sets the budget for you, but you have a lot of discretion on how you spend it.
Yep. And indeed, this is basically the task of USG's so-called president. His most important function is to pretend to be in charge. And this is the one function in which the entire executive branch, plus, of course, the White House proper, will enthusiastically assist him. For a good look at what George W. Bush actually does, I find this page invaluable. If you are anything like me, your eyes will immediately be drawn to the executive order of October the 20th, 2007, protection of striped bass and red drum fish populations.
This did not age well. The executive orders since then have been way, way more impactful than that.
Yeah. I mean, Bush already had a lot of impactful executive orders as of 2008.
That's true.
This is a fine example of the petty whims by which Chimpy Bush Hitler, notorious fascist and fanatic angler, rules our nation. Bush Hitler and his notorious Goring-like henchman Dick McDick, when they are not torturing nuns, spend all their time out on the Chesapeake fishing for striped bass, red drum, and other brackish white-fleshed piscids. So Bush Hitler and McDick, spitting in the face of our economically vital seafood industry, have taken striped bass and red drum off America's dinner table, reserving these delicious fish for themselves and their well-heeled sports fishing cronies. Just another day in the Republican reign of terror, kids. Right, what actually happened? Why did this pearl drop from the president's pen? Because someone put it in front of him and he signed it. And as I mentioned a couple times, I come from a civil service family. Honorable as it may seem, I was raised and educated on your tax dollars. And if there is one modern production which everyone who I've ever met who had ever been involved in government considers an accurate portrayal of the actual thing as it actually is of course, Yes, Minister. Which, by the way, is a very funny British comedy show from the 80s about how government works. If, like me, you are allergic to canned laughter, the scripts are available as a book, which is perfectly readable, but see below. The one mystery about YM, for me, was how the people who wrote it found out. Surely it is not possible, even at the BBC, to be both a senior civil servant and a TV screenwriter. Since, as Lao Tzu put it, those who talk don't know, and those who know don't talk. The existence of this show, isolated example though it is, struck me as implausible. Yet there it is. As with so many childhood conundrums, the internet has resolved this for me. The principal source for YM is the posthumously published diaries of Richard Crossman, who was housing minister in the 1960s under Harold Wilson. I can only shudder at the concrete horrors of which he must be responsible, at least nominally responsible. As a glance at the first page of his diary will confirm, Crossman simply is Jim Hacker. Other personalities are also quite recognizable. My edition, abridged in 750 pages, begins with this entry. Thursday, October 22nd. I was appointed Minister of Housing on Saturday, October the 17th, 1964. Now it is only the 22nd, but oh dear, it seems a long, long time. It also seems as though I had transferred myself completely to this new life as cabinet minister. In a way, it's just the same as I had expected and predicted. The room in which I sit is the same in which I saw Naib Bevan for almost the first time when he was Minister of Health, and I already realized the tremendous effort it requires not to be taken over by the civil service. My minister's room is like a padded cell, and in certain ways, I am like a person who is suddenly certified a lunatic and put safely into this great, vast room cut off from real life and surrounded by male and female trained nurses and attendants. When I am in a good mood, They occasionally allow an ordinary human being to come and visit me, but they make sure that I behave right and that the other person behaves right, and they know how to handle me. Of course, they don't behave quite like nurses because the civil servant is profoundly differential. Yes, minister. No, minister. If you wish, minister. And combined with this, there is a constant preoccupation to ensure that the minister does what is correct. The private secretary's job is to make sure that when the minister comes into Whitehall, he doesn't let the side of or himself down and behaves in accordance with the requirements of the institution. It is also profoundly true that one has only to do absolutely nothing whatsoever in order to be floated forward on the stream. I have forgotten what day it was. Indeed, the whole of my life in the last 4 days has gone into one curious single day when I turned to my private secretary, George Mosley, and said, "No, you must teach me how to handle all this correspondence." And he sat opposite me with his owlish eyes and said to me, "Well, minister, you see there are 3 ways of handling it. A letter can either be answered by you personally in your own handwriting, or we can draft a personal reply for you to sign. Or if the letter is not worth your answering personally, we can draft an official answer." "What's an official answer?" I asked. "Well, it says the minister has received your letter and the department replies." "Anyway, we'll draft all 3 variants," said Mosley. "And if you just tell us what you want." "How do I do that?" I asked. Well, you put all your in tray into your tray out tray, he said. "And if you put it in with your mark on it, we deal with it and you need never see it again." This is the default existence of every politician and political appointee in the modern Western system of government. They simply empty the inboxes into their outboxes. Well, how is that not the same for somebody in a corporate job?
Mm-hmm.
Isn't it the same thing?
Yep.
No, but you see, Logos, these are people that are bootstrapping it, making the world better by making us all richer. That's the difference. And the government's making us poor, right, Logos?
Something like that.
The civil service, which by definition is permanent and cannot be touched by anyone who is contaminated by the deadly strain of politics, takes care of the rest. As long as you believe in democratic centrism, the system makes perfect sense. Of course, life is only easy. Politicians who are aligned with the civil service, learning that the inspiration for Jim Hacker MP was a hard-line old laborite, makes perfect sense to me. The left is always, in every case, the party of the institutional civil service. Crossman's interactions with his nurses are comical because they are basically on the same side. If he decides to stop trying to swim and just float, he is unlikely to be horrified by the results. If he manages to flail around and actually get something done, they are unlikely to be horrified. There are no ministers or private secretaries in D.C. Crossman's opposite number in Washington, especially Washington today, would be surrounded by a small platoon of so-called sheed Cs, known to the punters as political appointees. There are a couple thousand of these jobs, which are listed in a wonderful little volume called the Plum Book. From the Beltway's view, the primary purpose of your vote this November is to decide who shall consume these plums, so sweet and so cold. My mother was a GS-15 at DOE, working on a budget and policy for renewable energy in the Clinton administration. The other day I asked her about the Cs. They get very nice offices, she said, and they do pretty much whatever they want. They're encouraged to find something and work on it. A legion of little Jim hackers. Here in America, everything comes in a bigger box. Of course, the politicians have another option. They can try to fight. Sometimes this is done by the so-called Republicans among them. Perhaps you have seen stories in the press that indicate that some elected mannequin or other is trying to politicize the operations of some responsible and professional arm of USG. This indicates that someone is struggling. Of course, the classic example of an American politician who really went to war with the Civil War was old Tail Gunner Joe, and we all know what happened to him. The basic strategy of the civil servant, when attacked by a politician or a political appointee, is to make his attacker or the attacker's political sponsor look bad in the press. Since politicians cannot be elected without the cooperation of the press, this strategy always works. Well, hold on, Logos. Why would that stop Moldbug at all? Because every time you try to play hardball with insurgents and put them in concentration camps, the international press gets wind of it and shuts you down.
That's true.
So,
but also remember, all that matters is the fact that you've got the best guns.
Well, I know. So how do we slice this thing up? Since Paul. But hold on. But if you have the best guns and they're like ID locked, but then they get hacked, what does that mean?
Well, that means they got hacked by a military insurgency that doesn't understand it's in their best interest not to be a military insurgency. It's just going to make the shares go down.
Right. Oh, since politicians cannot be elected without the crop. Okay. Since the press is effectively part of the civil service, of the new desks of the Post, the Times, and CNN were reorganized into a department of journalism, perhaps not unlike the BBC, the lives of reporters are hardly changed at all. The game is always on. I seem to recall a case recently in which a government employee was penalized for disclosing confidential information to the press. What do you think? Was he a career civil servant or just a C? No prizes to the winner. The issue is not exactly new. Here is Carlyle from his letter day pamphlet number 3, 1850. A mighty question indeed. Who shall be premier and take in hand the rudder of government, otherwise called the spigot of taxation? Shall it be the Honorable Felix Parvulus or the Right Honorable Felicissimus Zero? By our electioneerings and Hansard debatings and ever-enduring tempest of jargon that goes on everywhere, we managed to settle that, to have it declared with no bloodshed except insignificant blood from the nose in hustling time, but with the immense beer shed and ink shed and explosion of nonsense which darkens all the air, that the Right Honorable Zero is to be the man. That we firmly settle, Zero, all shivering with rapture and with terror, mounts into the high saddle, cramps himself on, with knees, heels, hands, and feet, and the horse gallops whither it lists. That Right Honorable Zero should attempt controlling the horse. Alas, alas, he sticking on with beak and claws is too happy if the horse will only gallop any whither and not throw him. Measure, polity, plan, or scheme of public good or evil is not in the head of the Felicissimus, except if he could but devise it, some measure that would please his horse for the moment, and encourage him to go with softer paces, Godward or devilward, as it might be, and save Felicissimus's leather, which is fast wearing. That is what we call a government in England for nearly 2 centuries now. What's interesting here, right? What's interesting here is Moldbug is going to make this as an argument in favor of his position. Now, Carlyle says for 2 centuries now. Okay, well, that would be 1650, and our boy Cromwell was in charge in 1650, which means that according to Carlyle, that was when good government ended.
Oh, man.
So how does Moldbug square? See, this is why Moldbug is full of crap. He knows that the Carlylean reading of English history is pro-Puritan, pro-Cromwell, and that if we take this snippet from Carlyle, good government ended with Cromwell. So, yeah. There you go.
I mean, Cromwell was really a base CEO that was running England for profit at the time, don't you know?
Right. Hey, look, nothing more formalist than Cromwell.
Nothing. I mean, Cromwell had the best shareholders, and he made them lots of money.
So I don't know what Moldbug is upset with Cromwell. I mean, he's just a good formalist, neo-cameralist CEO ruling Britain. Duh. The Paivuli and Felicini of Carlyle's time were giants next to the absurd non-entities who are trying to keep themselves on the horse today. And now it's more than like 4 centuries. Everything else is pretty much the same, though. So what do you think would happen to Ron Paul if he tries to stay on Carlyle's horse? So I guess what that means, Logos, is that Cromwell broke the horse in.
Yep.
I'm afraid there are exactly 2 possibilities. I believe Dr. Paul is an honorable man, so we need only consider the first, which is that he will fight the system and actually try to downsize DC. Okay, you know what? We're going to stop right here real quick. I mean, Moldbug is making some good points that, turning the clock back to get America to some earlier period of constitutional literacy and enforcement is extremely difficult at best and impossible at worst. But you know what's more impossible than all of that, Logos? Is being a freaking dark elf.
Yeah.
Like, what is he talking about? Oh, this is impossible, guys. Like, you can't live in government. It's impossible. Well, Ron Paul's just wasting your time. Meanwhile, give all your money to me, the dark elf insurgent, who will try to seduce the libs by poetry? Like,
What do you do a great job seducing the liberal elites by getting on the bad side of Ben Burgess and Matt McManus.
I mean, this is just so stupid. Of course, beyond his ability to block congressional legislation a courtesy Senate rules granted every single senator, people in D.C. who could stop things from happening are a dime a dozen. His power to nominate Supreme Court justices, oh, this didn't age well, who must still be confirmed by the Senate. And his note also that Republican presidents choose 7 out of the last 4 conservative justices, and his nominal command of the armed forces, whom he can at least order to stop wherever they are doing right now and come home, but so can Obama. President Paul will have no power whatsoever. Well, he's singing a different tune after the Roe decision, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
So here he's saying that appointing Supreme Court justices is meaningless. But in his now gray mirror, he's saying, no, you can't actually win. That works. Stop using it. Well,
Wait,
how does that
again?
Well, now when he tells the conservatives to not do what works, his thing about DeSantis with when we saw the interview with Warren McIntyre, and what he's also said on Gray Mirror, he tacitly admits that putting Supreme Court justices in does work, and they should stop doing it.
Kinda. He thinks that it gets the left really, really mad, but doesn't buy them any permanent power.
Right, but it does achieve goals. Right here, he's saying it's just completely inefficacious. So the inefficacy here isn't that it makes the left mad; it's that it doesn't work.
Oh well, yeah, of course. You had to update in Gray Mirror because Roe got overturned.
That's what I mean. That's what I mean. This is just full of crap. That was my point.
Yeah. Okay.
But don't worry, he'll still have the power to make a fool of himself, at least as portrayed in the eyes of the press. His popular, okay, to be fair, Moldbug has done more to make a fool of himself in the eyes of the press than Ron Paul has. Ron Paul at least came off as you got to remember, back in 2008, there were far left progressives that were on the side of Ron Paul. In fact, Cenk Uygur was actually on the side of Ron Paul.
Yes.
So actually, no, Ron Paul was seen as a dignified old man that had some positions that you might not like, but you could agree with him on some of them.
Ron Paul was almost like 2016 Tulsi Gabbard, or 2020 Tulsi Gabbard.
Yes, and there were many on the left that liked him, on some issues, and were willing to work together on those issues, such as the banks, such as the wars.
I mean, great examples would be Bernie Sanders and Dennis Kucinich.
So again, this is an entirely unfair treatment of Ron Paul.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean he wasn't attacked by the media. Of course he was. There was the Ron Paul letters that many people think were edited by the guy from the Mises Institute. I can't think of his name now. But Lou Rockwell. There we go. But whatever the case of that might be, there were many on the left. In fact, the very people that are coming after that are coming after Moldbug from the far left, their earlier OG iterations were on the side of Ron Paul. So, on some issues, admittedly. His popularity will descend into the single digits. The result will be that Americans will consider libertarianism discredited for at least the next 20 years. As if for the same kind of diehards who support him now, everyone who will vote for Ron Paul in 2008 will realize by 2012 that they were swept up in a wave of craziness. They had no idea what they were thinking, and they will certainly never think it again. Well, that was false, because he had another huge rise in 2012. Logos?
Yeah.
2012 was kind of the high watermark for Ron Paul, actually.
It kind of was, yeah.
So, that didn't age well, did it?
Well, he didn't win, but...
No, he didn't win. I know. In other words, the problem with believing in Dr. Paul is that Dr. Paul is a candidate in a Democratic election. To vote for him and believe you're doing something meaningful and important, it's necessary to believe not just one thing, Ron Paul, but in two, Ron Paul and contemporary American democracy. Obviously, when Paulistas talk about the press and its vicious vendetta against Dr. Paul, we can see that they have no illusions about their enemies. Their illusion is strictly confined to their friends, or those they imagine to be their friends. They huddle around the belief that the American electorate will come to its senses in a great flash of political light, and that once they come to their senses, they will remain there. This Damascus experience will be triggered simply by the realization that America, as a libertarian country, was founded as such and has remained as such deep in the American heart. Well, let me ask you this, Logos. What's more crazy? that you can think the American people can have a Damascus experience or that the elites can have a Damascus experience.
Yeah, exactly. Especially if you believe that the elite is spontaneously causing all these problems in the first place.
I mean, this just writes itself, and this is ridiculous. I mean, I'm not saying the American people having a Damascus experience is likely, but like, what's more likely, them or the elites?
Yeah, basically.
By
TLDR
some
of all, I think we'd find Moldbug much more palatable if he'd just say, "Meh, system's unsalvageable. It's going to break." And then here's how we can rebuild it. Of course, we disagree about how to rebuild it, but this whole dark hobbit or dark elf plan, whatever, it's just so goofy.
Well, he doesn't really want it to end. That's the thing.
Exactly. Yes.
He doesn't really want it to. I mean, he admits in his very first essay on formalism, he's a well-paid serf, and he likes that position. There's a word for that, Logos. It's called Stockholm syndrome.
Only if he's not the abuser.
Right, but like if you're in a hierarchical institution and then people are just ordering you, most Americans would view that as being abused.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess Moldbug doesn't, but then again, who knows what he believes, because he's got money telling him what to say. So what does Moldbug really believe? That's anyone's guess. Excuse my French, but this is crap. Americans are like everyone else. They believe what they're told to believe. They respond to superior authority. For the last 75 years, they've been told that the state is their mom and father, or possibly both. And now they develop the official we with a gay abandon. And we gotta like tone police here. Moldbug. Never mind. I have a tough time removing this malignant pronoun from my tongue, and I do try. Americans simply cannot imagine life except in the warm arms of their official universal uber parent. If you're trying to save the old libertarian America, you arrived at the scene a little late. Electing Paul is like showing up at an autopsy with a human liver. Yes, it's true the patient did die of liver failure, but that was a week ago. I suppose it can't hurt to try and put the thing in, but I really doubt it will do any good. Anthony Howard, the editor of my Crossman edition, describes Crossman's struggle as a Fabian who happened to believe in democracy. Yeah, we're not going to read that part. The most familiar change brought against Crossman, even while he lived, was that of inconsistency. Yet in one area, from the days when he was a young Oxford Don, he was constant as the Northern Star. His first and favorite book, Plato Today, wrestles with the problem of to what degree British parliamentary democracy is a sham and a fraud or a hoax, and it was a question that Crossman continued to tussle with until the day he died. It made him highly unusual, not to say unorthodox politician, his fellow practitioners of the craft being more genuinely noted for conveying complacency rather than betraying disquiet about a system that at least had the merit of recognizing their own talents. Crossman, however, as well as possessing the bump of irrelevance that he was much given to boasting about, had thought his career a passionate and at times inconvenient commitment to the notion of making democracy actually work. His haunting doubt, and this is apparent in his last public lecture as in his first book, was that in some way the British electorate was being fobbed off with that what Plato called the noble lie. In other words, that the British voter, while encouraged to believe what he was part of a self-governing democracy, wasn't in fact through the device of the so-called representative institutions enduring a government by oligarchy. The guilty secret at the heart of the British governmental system, Crossman came increasingly to believe, was that it was deliberately designed not to give ordinary people their heads, but rather to tame the demon of democracy before it did too much damage. Indeed. Of course, as our regular readers of you are aware, the demon is most definitely a demon. Taming it is the most important function of modern governments. There was a time in American history when the president was actually the CEO of the executive branch, more or less. At least he controlled personnel. This was called the spoils system. It cannot be said to have worked in any sense of the word, and limiting it to what is now the plum books was the great achievement of the reformers of the 1880s. So we have established the following facts. Ron Paul's unelectable, being NS and all. If Ron Paul is elected, the civil service oligarchy will crush him like a bug. The only thing worse than civil service oligarchy is actual democracy. What is the alternative? Is there an alternative? Or are we just all doomed? Tune in to part 2 for the stunning yet obvious answer. Okay, so in light of Trump, 1 is true based on history. 2 is true based off of Trump's history. 3 is, Moldbug being Moldbug.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Logos, anything you want to say to these things?
No, I'm interested to see where the economics article goes. I mean, I didn't end up disagreeing with it a whole lot with it, because a lot of the stuff he was talking about wasn't a uniquely Austrian analysis. The only thing the Austrian part's going to come in is where like debt causes business cycle fluctuations or something like that. Um, and that's where I'll have some disagreement. So I'm curious to see where that goes. It's too bad we had this weird Ron Paul article in the middle. Um, I mean, I feel like the Ron Paul article is kind of beating a dead horse. We already know what we have to say about most of that, and I think by now so does the audience. But I don't know.
Yeah, fair enough. But we won't go back to the economics one for a while. Now, next week, everyone, Logos and I will just do a sole TLDR for 2007, and we'll give you the hot takes for those that don't want to slog through 30 plus hours of content, which I don't blame you. So, is there anything you want to end with for today, Logos?
No, I think I'm good.
All right, it's Todd Lewis of the Prayers of Folly podcast, signing off.